Everyone at that rooftop table thought they knew exactly who I was when they passed the menu over my water glass and called me the responsible one. By the end of the night, they'd realize I was also the one holding the plug to their entire lifestyle. My name is Samantha Blake. I'm 32 years old, and for as long as I can remember, my value in my family has been measured in receipts. Growing up in a cramped Newark apartment where the fridge hummed louder than the arguments, I learned early that the quickest way to make tension disappear was to reach for my wallet, first with babysitting money, then bakery paychecks, and eventually with a salary that made everyone else relax the moment I walked through the door. When I moved to New York and landed a solid accounting job in Midtown, my parents didn't say, "We're proud of you." They said, "Now we can finally breathe." On paper, it sounded harmless, a daughter helping out, picking up the slack when bills were late or when my younger brother needed a little seed money for another vague project. The problem is, temporary became routine fast. One celebratory dinner became monthly treats, emergencies started arriving with perfectly timed selfies from casino parking garages, and any time I hesitated, the same line appeared, "After everything we did for you, you're really going to say no?" By the time I realized my family had gotten used to living two tax brackets higher than they earned, powered entirely by my quiet transfers and automatic payments, I wasn't their daughter anymore. I was their invisible bank. The night everything shifted started like all the others. A text from my mother, no greeting, just a screenshot of a reservation at a trendy rooftop restaurant in Midtown Manhattan. "Our anniversary. We want to celebrate with our successful girl. 7 p.m. Don't be late." No one asked if I could afford it. No one asked if I wanted to be there. They just assumed, like always, that I would show up, smile for the photos, and hand over my card when the leather check presenter hit the table. What they didn't know was that, for the first time in my life, I had spent the previous week looking at our history the way I look at a client's books, and I didn't like what I saw. My parents didn't see the spreadsheet on my laptop, the one where I'd finally added up every little favor I'd covered over the last 10 years. They didn't see the date the first transfer appeared, the note fields I'd written in the beginning to remind myself what each payment was for, or the way those notes slowly disappeared as the requests stopped being requests and became expectations. They didn't see the total at the bottom of the screen, a number large enough to make my stomach drop even though I knew every digit by memory. All they saw was the version of me they'd built, the steady daughter, the one who never made a scene, the one who picked up the bill because it was easier that way. In that quiet week before the rooftop dinner, I did something I'd never done. I treated my own life like a case. I pulled statements, highlighted transfers, and sorted transactions by who they actually served. Patterns appeared that I couldn't unsee. The months when Jordan was between jobs lined up perfectly with spikes and withdrawals labeled "help" or "just this once." The year my parents claimed they were cutting back still showed regular charges from high-end restaurants and weekend hotels, all following deposits from me. It wasn't a series of isolated moments, it was a structure. And at the center of it was the story everyone told themselves, that I was the strong one, the successful one, the one who would never let them fall. Sitting at my small kitchen table in Queens, with the city noise humming outside and my laptop casting a blue glow across the room, I realized something simple and terrifying. I had built an entire lifestyle for 3 other adults without ever being asked if I wanted to. I had been so afraid of being called ungrateful or selfish that I hadn't noticed how selfish they had become. That was the night I closed the spreadsheet, logged into every shared account, and started quietly pulling my name off anything that could drag me down with them. I didn't send a dramatic message. I didn't warn anyone. I decided that if my family was going to treat me like a financial institution instead of a person, then they could learn, like everyone else, what happens when the account finally closes. Everyone thinks the moment everything breaks is loud. In my family, it happened in slow, quiet transactions, one "thanks, sweetheart" at a time, until I realized the only thing holding us together was my routing number. On Sundays, the pattern always looked innocent. My parents would call from the car on their way back from running errands, their voices light, music low in the background. They'd talk about traffic on the turnpike or how the bridge tolls were ridiculous now, then slip in the real reason for the call. The cable company had messed up the bill. The landlord was being unreasonable again. Jordan's big opportunity needed one last push. There was always a story, always a timing issue, always some vague injustice that made it feel like I wasn't just sending money, I was rescuing them from something unfair. When I hesitated, the tone shifted. My father would sigh heavily, mention how hard he'd worked when we were kids. My mother would ask if I remembered when they skipped meals so I could have new textbooks. No one ever asked how many dinners I'd skipped in Queens to keep their version of generosity alive. The more stable my life in New York became, the less stable theirs pretended to be. When I got promoted to senior accountant, my parents celebrated by driving into the city and booking a table at a trendy bistro in Midtown because our daughter made it. They ordered oysters, steaks, cocktails with names they couldn't pronounce. They toasted to my success, told the server loudly about my job, smiled like they'd just watched me win an award. The check sat in the middle of the table like a test they already knew I'd pass. When I reached for it, my mother pressed her hand to her chest and said, "See? That's our girl. Always taking care of everyone." In the cab home that night, I checked my bank app and tried to frame it as a one-time splurge. 2 months later, we were back in another restaurant, another special occasion, another silent handoff of the bill. Jordan's role in all of this was simpler and somehow more infuriating. He floated from idea to idea, clothing lines, car detailing, a podcast that never got past 3 episodes, each one requiring startup cash he didn't have and I wouldn't even miss. When his credit card got declined at a bar, he called me from the sidewalk, laughing, asking if I could just slide a payment through real quick. When he wanted to impress a new girlfriend, he took her to places I couldn't afford to take myself, then texted me receipts with captions like, "You're the best, sis." My parents framed it as me investing in his future. What I was really doing was underwriting his image so he could keep playing the role of the charming younger son who just needed one more chance. The first time someone outside my family questioned this, I was in the break room at work, staring at my phone. Elena walked in, microwaving leftovers, and caught the look on my face. She didn't pry, she just stood next to me, waiting for her food, until I exhaled and said, "Do you ever feel like you're the only adult in your family?" She glanced at the screen, at the string of messages from my mother, rent due, their threatening fees, "We'll pay you back when things calm down," and raised an eyebrow. "How often does that happen?" she asked. I shrugged automatically and said, "Not that much," then heard my own voice and knew I was lying. Later that afternoon, she stopped by my desk with a casual, "If you ever want to look at your finances the way we look at clients, no emotion, just numbers, I'd be happy to help." I didn't take her up on it right away. Instead, I continued doing what I always did. When my parents wanted to celebrate a small promotion my father got at the warehouse, they didn't choose the diner they'd gone to for years. They picked a new place in Midtown they'd seen on television, all glass walls and skyline views. The hostess greeted them like regulars by the end of that year, even though nothing in their actual bank statements justified being there. The staff started recognizing me too, but for a different reason. I was the one who arrived in work clothes, hugged everyone, and quietly handed over a card without needing to look at the total. "You're so lucky to have a daughter like that," one server told my mother once, thinking I was out of earshot. My mother smiled and said, "We raised her right," as if generosity had been taught, not demanded. In my apartment in Queens, the contrast was sharp. My furniture was simple and paid for in full, no payment plans, no deferred interest. I brought lunch to work most days. I tracked my own expenses down to the dollar. On paper, I was doing everything right. In practice, my savings account grew slower than my title suggested it should, and any time I tried to plan for my future, maybe a condo, maybe grad school, maybe just a real vacation that didn't involve visiting family, something urgent came up. A medical bill, a car repair, a late fee. Sometimes, they didn't even bother with a story. They just sent the amount and, "We need you." It wasn't until the text about the rooftop anniversary dinner, that breathless, assumption-filled, "we want to celebrate with our successful girl," that I finally saw the pattern for what it was. They weren't asking for help anymore. They were scheduling withdrawals. That night, sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop open and Elena's offer echoing in my head, I scrolled through years of transactions and realized my family had never once asked a different question, the one that would have changed everything. Not, "Can you cover this?" Not, "How much can you send?" Just a simple, "Is this hurting you?" They didn't ask because they didn't want to know. And until that moment, I hadn't wanted to know either. Most people don't get their wake-up call from a stranger with a spreadsheet, but that's exactly what happened to me. Not because I couldn't see the problem, because I'd spent years refusing to look at it in one place. Elena didn't sit me down in some dramatic intervention. It started with a casual, "You busy after work?" and a walk to a quiet coffee shop 3 blocks from the office. She opened her laptop, slid it between us, and said, "Humor me. Let's just pull the last 12 months. I told myself it was just curiosity, a chance to see where my money was going, the way we do for clients all the time. But when I logged in and the numbers populated row after row, something in my chest tightened. There it was in black and white, my salary, my rent, my student loan payments, and then a long unbroken column labeled Zelle, Venmo, external transfer. Same 3 names over and over. We didn't talk much at first. Elena just asked simple, neutral questions. "What's this? How often does this happen? Did they pay you back?" I'd answer automatically. That was rent once. That was an emergency. That was a one-time thing. Until we hit the same name 4 times in a single month, different amounts, same story. I heard myself say, "I don't even remember what that one was for," and watched her eyebrows lift slightly. "If a client said that," she asked quietly, "what would you call it?" I stared at the screen at transfers labeled help, utilities, just this once, and realized the words I use at work, unsustainable, pattern, exposure, fit here too. They just hurt more. When we pulled back from 1 year to 5, the picture stopped being blurry. It was a mural. There was the first big transfer to keep my parents from being evicted, followed by a family dinner to celebrate that everything worked out. There was the lump sum for Jordan's can't-miss business idea, followed by a charge from a high-end sneaker store the next day. There were the restaurant charges, neatly lined up with my parents' anniversaries and "we deserve a treat" nights, almost always followed by relief-tinged texts, "You saved us. We don't know what we'd do without you." At the very bottom of the sheet, where the totals summed automatically, a number stared back at me that I would never have agreed to give anyone all at once. Somehow, piece by piece, I had. Elena didn't label my family. She didn't call them names or tell me what to do. She just pointed at the total and said, "If I told you this was one of our clients, what advice would you give her?" That question cut through years of guilt in a single breath. I thought about the things I say in conference rooms. "You're overextended. You need boundaries. You can't keep funding behavior that's sinking you." It felt wrong to apply those words to my parents, to my brother, to people who had held me as a baby and sat in cheap bleachers at my middle school graduations. But the numbers didn't care about sentiment. They just told the truth. The next steps were small on the surface and enormous underneath. I scheduled a call with a financial advisor Elena recommended, someone who had no history with my family and no interest in anything but the math. I walked through my income, my debt, my goals, and then, with a knot in my stomach, the transfers. She listened, asked a few clarifying questions, and then said the phrase I had been avoiding even in my own head, "This is financial abuse." Not in the dramatic movie sense, not with shouting or threats, but in the way an unchecked expectation had become a permanent claim on my life. "You've normalized your own sacrifice so much," she added gently, "that you don't recognize how much of your future you've already given away." Together, we mapped out what disentangling would look like, not as a fantasy, but as a sequence. Remove my name from my parents' joint checking account, the one I'd been temporarily added to years ago to help with online banking. Close the old credit card I'd co-signed for Jordan when he was trying to build credit, now quietly maxed and never fully paid on time. Stop automatic transfers labeled rent and utilities, and switch them to manual, so any help would require a conscious decision, not a reflex. Every step felt like prying my fingers off a ledge I'd been clinging to since I was 18. I didn't tell my family any of this, not because I wanted to blindside them, but because I knew exactly how the conversation would go. They'd cry, they'd remind me of sacrifices I never asked them to make, they'd accuse me of being brainwashed by people who don't understand family. And in the end, I'd feel so guilty I'd undo everything before it even started. So instead, I sat alone in my apartment on a quiet Tuesday night, logged into each account, and hit Remove Authorized User, Close, Cancel Automatic Transfer. Each confirmation screen felt like a tiny exhale I didn't know I'd been holding. When the text about the rooftop anniversary dinner came through a week later, my phone buzzed against the table, right next to an open notebook where I'd sketched out my new budget, one that finally had room for my life. We want to celebrate with our successful girl. 7 p.m. Don't be late. No question mark. No, can you make it? It read less like an invitation and more like a summons. For a moment, the old reflex kicked in. Say yes, show up, fix it. Then I looked at the pages in front of me, at the total on Elena's spreadsheet in my mind, and realized this dinner was not just another bill. It was going to be an audit, not of my finances, but of the story my family had been telling themselves for years. This time, I wasn't coming as their invisible bank. I was coming as the person who had finally seen the ledger for what it was. The hardest part wasn't walking into that restaurant. It was deciding before I ever got there that no matter what happened at that table, I wasn't going to rescue anyone this time. The night of the dinner, Manhattan felt like it was performing for someone else. The hotel lobby was all marble and soft lighting, full of people who looked like they never checked their bank balances before handing over a card. I took the elevator up alone, watching my own reflection in the mirrored walls. On the outside, I looked like the version of myself my parents liked to brag about. Tailored blazer, neat hair, calm face. Inside, I kept repeating one quiet sentence. You are not their bank anymore. The rooftop restaurant wrapped around the building like a glass collar, all floor-to-ceiling windows and low, expensive music. My parents had chosen a table near the edge, with a perfect view of the skyline and just enough visibility to make sure everyone could see them enjoying it. They were already mid-story when I walked up. My father laughing loudly, my mother nodding along, Jordan spinning some tale about a collaboration that sounded more like a fantasy than a plan. No one stood to greet me. My mother waved me over with a bright, practiced smile. There she is, she said. Our successful girl. We went ahead and ordered. You know how long the kitchen takes up here. The menus were already closed, pushed aside to make room for cocktails and half-finished appetizers. A server appeared at my elbow with a drink I hadn't ordered. Your usual, he said politely. My parents beamed. We're regulars now, my father said, proud, as if he'd earned it. I thought about how many of these visits I'd funded and took a slow sip, letting the bitterness sit on my tongue. The conversation moved around me, familiar and scripted. My mother talked about neighbors back in Newark. My father complained about younger guys at the warehouse who don't know what real work is. Jordan dropped vague hints about an upcoming big break and how he'd take care of everyone when it hit. No one asked about my week. No one asked why my eyes looked tired. The clues that this night was different were small, but I noticed all of them. My mother kept glancing at her phone, at a banking app she thought she'd hidden with a tilt of her hand. My father checked his wallet twice before the main course even arrived. Jordan's jokes were a little too loud, his smile too sharp at the edges. Somewhere between the second round of drinks and the dessert menu, my mother reached across the table, patted my hand, and said, You know, we always knew you'd be the one to look out for this family. Your brother's got big dreams, your father's back is shot, she laughed lightly. But you You've always been steady. That's why we wanted to celebrate properly tonight. We deserve it, and so do you. The leather check presenter arrived a few minutes later, placed neatly in the center of the table like a prop we all knew how to use. The server disappeared with the kind of practiced discretion that comes from watching the same scene play out every night. For a moment, no one moved. Then my father cleared his throat, my mother smiled at me, and Jordan leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, as if settling in for a show. "Whenever you're ready, sweetheart," my mother said softly, nudging the folder a fraction of an inch in my direction. It was the same line she'd used a dozen times, the same tone, the same expectation. Only one thing had changed. I didn't reach for it. Instead, I folded my hands in my lap and let the silence sit there, heavy and unfamiliar. My mother's smile faltered. She nudged the folder again, then glanced at my father. "Sam," she said, still light, but with a new edge beneath it. "They're waiting." Jordan chuckled under his breath. "She's doing the dramatic pause," he said. "Come on, don't scare Mom like that." I looked at each of them, one by one, the way I look at a set of numbers I'm about to explain to a room full of people who don't want to hear them. "I'm not paying for tonight," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it was steady. "Not this time. Not anymore." People talk about plates crashing and doors slamming when families finally break. In my case, it was the sound of nothing. No one moving, no one breathing, just three people staring at me like I'd spoken a language they didn't know. My mother recovered first. She laughed, a brittle, too-high sound, and reached for the check presenter as if to prove this was a joke. "Don't be silly," she said. "You know how this works. We invited you to celebrate. You're the one with the real job." Her fingers rested on the leather, but she didn't open it. She didn't need to. She already knew the total would be more than anything they were prepared to cover. My father's jaw tightened. "Sam," he said, voice low. "This isn't the time for games. They know us here. Don't embarrass us." Jordan shook his head, amused. "You're really committing to this bit, huh?" he said. "Come on. Just put it on your card like always. I'll hit you back when this next project lands." The same promises, the same lines. Only now, they slid off me instead of sinking in. "I'm not playing," I said. "I've been paying." I watched the words land, watched my father's face darken, my mother's eyes narrow. "For years," I continued, keeping my tone even. "Rent, utilities, emergencies, dinners like this over and over. I've kept track." I tapped my temple lightly. "And not just here." Jordan scoffed. "You're really going to make a scene over a couple of nights out," he said. "You know you make more than all of us combined." I met his gaze. "You're right," I said. "I do. That's why I know exactly how much of it I've spent on things that have nothing to do with my life." My mother bristled. "We're family," she snapped. "Parents help kids, kids help parents. That's how it works." After everything we sacrificed, I cut her off gently. "You keep saying after everything we did for you," I said. "But you've never once asked what this has done to me." The server hovered at a distance, sensing something sharp in the air. Nearby tables went quieter, not obviously staring, but listening in the way people do when they recognize tension dressed in nice clothes. My father leaned in, voice dropping. "If you had a problem with helping," he said, "you should have said something. You don't ambush your own parents in public." I felt the old reflex, apologize, backtrack, offer a compromise, rise up like a wave and force myself to let it pass. "I did say something," I replied. "Every time I hesitated. Every time I asked if you were sure. Every time I suggested a cheaper place or said I needed to save. You just pushed past it. You liked the version of me who never said no better." My mother's voice went cold. So what? You talk to some outsider who doesn't understand us, and suddenly we're villains? Her eyes flashed. You think that woman at your job knows more about our family than we do? I could have denied it, but there was no point. She knows numbers, I said. And the numbers don't lie. They say I've given you enough to buy a car outright. Enough to clear your debts twice. Enough to fund every one of Jordan's big breaks and then some. They say I've been living like a single person with an average salary while carrying 4 adults on my back. I let that hang between us. They also say I'm done. My father pushed his chair back slightly, like he might stand up and walk out. Then he glanced at the check, at the glittering room around us, and thought better of it. You really want to do this here? He muttered. In front of everyone? I followed his gaze around the restaurant. The lit skyline, the polished glasses, the other tables where cards changed hands without drama. This is exactly where this belongs, I said. You were happy to let me fund this place. You can be the ones to pay it for once. I turned to the server and raised a hand. He approached cautiously. We'll need separate checks, I said. My mother inhaled sharply. Separate, she repeated, like it was an obscenity. Yes, I answered. Mine and yours. The server nodded and retreated with the folder. My mother stared at me like she didn't recognize the person sitting across from her. You're enjoying this, she said quietly. Watching us squirm. I shook my head. I'm not, I said. I'm tired. There's a difference. Jordan leaned forward, lowering his voice. You know what people are going to say when they hear about this? He hissed. That you left your own parents hanging over a dinner bill. That you abandoned your family. I met his stare without flinching. They can say what they want, I replied. They haven't seen the spreadsheet. When the checks came back, the separation was physical, not just emotional. 2 slim black folders set side by side. The server placed one in front of me, one between my parents. I opened mine, glanced at the total, and slid my card in without ceremony. Across from me, my mother's hands hovered over the other folder like it might burn her. My father finally flipped it open, his face tightening as he scanned the amount. This is ridiculous, he muttered. They must have added something extra. For the first time, it occurred to me that they had never really known what these nights cost. Why would they? They'd never had to look. My mother dug in her purse, pulled out a card, and hesitated. I don't know if this will go through, she whispered. You know how things have been. Her eyes flicked up to mine, searching for the old reflex, the familiar rush to save them from embarrassment. I felt the pull in my chest, the urge to say, It's okay, I've got it, just one more time. Instead, I folded my napkin and placed it on the table. Then maybe, I said gently, this is the last place you should be eating. She stared at me like I'd slapped her. They handed over the card. The server walked away. The pause that followed stretched long enough for second thoughts to try and worm their way in. When he returned and set the receipt down, my mother exhaled with visible relief. See? My father said gruffly. We handled it. But his voice lacked its usual swagger. The safety net was gone, and everyone at that table knew it, even if they refused to admit it out loud. I signed my receipt, tucked my card into my wallet, and stood. My mother reached out, fingers closing around my wrist. Sam, she said, and in her voice was something I hadn't heard in a long time, uncertainty. We'll talk about this later. I gently loosened her grip. We will, I agreed. But I'm not going to forget what we talked about here. I picked up my bag, nodded a polite goodbye, and walked toward the elevator. Behind me, I could feel their eyes on my back, feel the weight of all the versions of me they preferred slipping away with each step. Outside, the city air felt colder, sharper, but also cleaner. For the first time in years, I walked away from a family dinner without checking my bank account, and that felt like the real luxury. The fallout didn't arrive as one big explosion. It came in smaller, quieter aftershocks, missed calls, half-finished texts, and a kind of silence that felt less like peace and more like people scrambling on the other side of a closed door. The first text came that same night, long after I'd kicked off my shoes and set my bag down on the chair by the door. "You blindsided us," my mother wrote. "That wasn't fair." There was no question about whether I got home safely, no acknowledgement that I'd been paying for nights like that for years. I stared at the message, thumb hovering over the keyboard, then locked my phone and walked away. In the past, I would have sent 3 paragraphs explaining myself, apologizing for my tone, trying to soften what I'd done. This time, I let the message sit unanswered. The next morning, there were 3 more, one from my father, accusing me of making them look poor, one from Jordan calling me dramatic, and another from my mother asking if I was really going to throw away everything we've built over money. The word "we" landed the hardest. I thought of the spreadsheet, of lines that only ever flowed one way, and understood that we had never been building the same thing. Over the next few weeks, their social media told a story they didn't realize I was reading. The check-ins at expensive restaurants stopped. The photos of cocktails with skyline views were replaced with takeout containers at home. My father posted a vague complaint about ungrateful kids that got a handful of sympathetic comments from people who didn't know the details. Jordan's feed quieted down, fewer new shoes, more selfies in the same hoodie, captions about grinding in silence. None of this felt triumphant. It felt like watching a house settle after years of leaning on a beam that was never meant to carry that much weight. Inside my own life, the changes were subtle but constant. I stopped flinching when my phone buzzed. My budget, for the first time, balanced without a hidden family column swallowing the difference. I signed up for a weekend class I'd been putting off for years because there was always something more important to pay for. I cooked real meals instead of living on whatever was cheapest that week. Elena and I ate dinner at a quiet neighborhood place in Queens, nothing flashy, just good food and easy conversation. When the check came, we split it down the middle out of habit. I realized, halfway through handing over my card, that I didn't feel that familiar tightening in my chest. No one here was waiting to see if I'd save them. I didn't cut my family off. When my mother called, I answered, short, calm, no apologies. When she circled back to the dinner, her voice edged with hurt and accusation, I let her talk and then said, "I'm not going to keep paying for things you can't afford. That's not cruelty. That's a boundary." She didn't like the word. She said it like it tasted bitter. "You've changed," she told me. "You used to be so easy." I thought about the girl stuffing cash into white envelopes, the woman sliding her card across linen-covered tables, and realized she wasn't wrong. I had changed. I'd stopped confusing being easy to rely on with being easy to use. What surprised me most wasn't their anger. It was the absence of the crushing guilt I'd been bracing for. There were pangs, of course, late at night, when I thought about birthdays and holidays and the version of family I used to hope we might become. But underneath that was something steadier, something I hadn't recognized in myself before, the quiet knowledge that I had finally done the one thing no one had ever taught me to do. I had chosen not to disappear inside the people I loved. If you've ever been the one at the table who always reaches for the bill, the one who smooths over every crisis, the one everyone counts on without ever asking what it costs you, here's the truth no one at that rooftop restaurant was willing to say out loud: you are allowed to stop. You are allowed to let other adults feel the weight of their own choices. You are allowed to close accounts that were opened in your name without your consent, even if the people holding them share your last name. The night I walked away from that dinner, I didn't just leave my parents with a check. I left them with something they'd spent years avoiding, a clear view of what life looks like without a daughter they treat like a bottomless card. And for the first time, the only person I needed to be able to live with after that wasn't them. It was me. By the time the last chapter of this story begins, the loud part is already over. There's no dramatic showdown left, no slammed doors, no viral-worthy confrontation. What's left is the quieter question that always comes after you finally say no. What does your life look like when it's no longer built around keeping other people comfortable? A few months after the rooftop dinner, the city moved on the way it always does. Sirens, subway brakes, people rushing past each other with coffee cups and headphones. My life shifted in smaller, measurable ways. For the first time since I'd started working in Midtown, my paycheck stayed mine after the bills were paid. My savings account crossed a number I'd never seen before, not because I suddenly earned more, but because nothing was leaking out the bottom. I signed a lease renewal in Queens without mentally subtracting family emergencies from the year ahead. On Friday nights, I met Elena for simple dinners in neighborhood spots instead of racing to beat a reservation my parents had already made in Manhattan. The absence of constant financial panic felt strange at first, like living in an apartment where a constant hum had finally stopped and you only realized how loud it was once it was gone. My parents adjusted, though they would never have called it that. Holidays got smaller. They chose restaurants in New Jersey again, the kind with laminated menus and early bird specials. My father complained more often about money, but the complaints had a different tone now. They weren't delivered with the same lazy confidence that I would step in. My mother still hinted occasionally about tight months and surprise bills, but when I didn't rush to offer, she changed the subject instead of pressing. Jordan took on a real job, not a dream project, not an opportunity, but regular hours with a regular paycheck. On the rare occasions we all sat at the same table, the check lingered in the middle a little longer while they figured out how to split it among themselves. That awkwardness wasn't mine to solve anymore. Our relationship didn't become a fairy tale. They didn't suddenly turn into people who apologized in full sentences or thanked me for the years I'd spent keeping them afloat. What changed was the direction of the traffic. When they called, they were more likely to talk about weather, neighbors, small aches and pains. When money came up, I said, "I can't do that," and let the silence settle. Sometimes they accepted it. Sometimes they pushed. Either way, I kept the boundary in place. It turned out the world didn't end when I stopped cushioning every fall. It just got more honest. The real ending to this story isn't the night in the rooftop restaurant. It's the night, months later, when I sat at my own kitchen table in Queens again, the same place I'd once stared at a spreadsheet full of everyone else's needs, and opened a different file. This one wasn't labeled rent, or utilities, or help. It was called future. I listed the things I wanted: a down payment, a trip that didn't involve sleeping on a relative's couch, a certification course that would bump my career forward because I wanted it, not because it would get me a raise to send more home. For the first time, those numbers didn't feel like fantasies. They felt like plans. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's not that you should humiliate your family over a dinner bill or cut every tie the moment you feel used. It's that love without boundaries turns into a ledger faster than you think. When people learn they can take from you without ever seeing the cost, they stop noticing you're bleeding. The most expensive check I ever paid wasn't that rooftop meal with the skyline view. It was the decade I spent funding other people's lives so they wouldn't have to face their own limits. Closing that tab, closing those accounts, saying that first real no, that was the first time I chose myself on purpose. And if you've been living as everyone's emergency fund, everyone's backup plan, everyone's responsible one, you need to know this: walking away from that role doesn't make you cruel. It makes you visible. In the end, I didn't need my parents to understand spreadsheets or boundaries or emotional labor. I needed to understand that I was allowed to stop disappearing. Once I did, the rest of the story, the smaller dinners, the quieter holidays, the thinner social media feeds, was just proof of something I should have learned a long time ago. When you finally stop paying for people who refuse to see your worth, the life you buy back is your own. The turning point wasn't a text or a phone call. It was a Tuesday evening when I walked past a boutique in Queens, saw a simple navy coat in the window, and realized I didn't have to run the price through an invisible filter of, what if they need something this week? I could just ask myself one question: do I want this? The answer was yes. I bought it. No guilt, no mental math about who else might come first. Walking home with the bag cutting into my fingers, I understood that this was what all those late nights with spreadsheets had really been about. Not just closing accounts, but reclaiming the right to make decisions that were only about me. My parents never turned into villains in a movie, and I never got the neat, tearful apology some part of me still fantasized about. They remained exactly who they had always been, people who loved me in the way they knew how, and who also learned, over years, to lean on me until I sank. The difference now is that the leaning has limits. When my mother says, "Things are a little tight," I say, "I hope it gets easier," instead of, "How much do you need?" When my father grumbles about kids these days, I don't volunteer my bank account as proof I'm different. And when Jordan hints about a can't-miss opportunity, I remind him gently that grown men are supposed to fund their own risks. They don't like it, but they've stopped assuming I'll forget. The last time we had dinner together, it was at a modest restaurant back in New Jersey. Plastic menus, paper napkins, a bill that didn't require deep breaths before opening. When the check came, my father picked it up, glanced at the total, and nodded. "We've got this," he said. It wasn't a grand gesture or a reversal of history. It was just 3 words, said without looking at me. For once, no one slid anything in my direction. No one called me the responsible one, like it was a job title. We walked out into the parking lot under harsh yellow lights, not skyline stars, but there was a strange lightness in my chest. It didn't come from watching them pay. It came from not feeling obligated to. If you want some kind of rule to walk away with, here it is. Love that demands receipts isn't love. It's an arrangement. And arrangements can be renegotiated, even if the people on the other side of the table act like the terms are carved in stone. You're allowed to ask where your money is going, where your time is going, where you are going in a story that keeps casting you as the silent provider. You're allowed to decide that the next chapter has to read differently, even if it means some people won't like their new roles. Looking back, that night on the rooftop wasn't revenge. Revenge would have been ordering one more bottle of their favorite wine, watching them panic when the total hit, and walking away smiling. What I did was simpler and, in its own way, harsher. I stopped pretending I was okay with disappearing. I let the consequences of their choices land where they belonged. The satisfaction didn't come from seeing them struggle with a bill. It came weeks later, when I sat on my own couch, in my own apartment, with my own future finally visible on the other side of a balanced sheet. If any part of this feels uncomfortably familiar, if you've ever stared at a receipt and thought, "Why am I the only one paying for this?" consider this your permission slip. You don't have to wait for a rooftop restaurant or a dramatic scene. You can start with one quiet no, one automatic transfer canceled, one dinner where you let the check sit in the middle of the table and see who reaches first. The world won't end. The story won't stop. It will just start being yours. Thanks for watching. Kindly subscribe for more.